So we've been leading up to it all quarter. We're finally at the cerebrum. In this first part, we're going to talk about the diencephalon, which is not the cerebral cortex. It is the lower part of the cerebrum. So for the learning objectives, I want you to be able to list the basic functions, general locations, and disorders. I say if any because some of them don't have a specific disorder associated with it, of the diencephalon, which is the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, and subthalamus. You may have already figured out at this point that any structure with the word thalamus in it is part of the diencephalon. I also want you to describe the composition and basic functions of subcortical white matter. So just by its name, you can figure out it's white matter. It's composed of axons, myelinated axons, and it's below the cortex. So we already know that much about subcortical white matter, and then we'll talk about the basic functions of it. So the diencephalon, like I said, includes all structures with the term thalamus in their names. The thalamus is, so I picked this picture from the book because you can see the thalamus is sort of the little egg-shaped structure right in the center of the brain. So its central location should tell you something about the importance of it. The thalamus receives information from the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and all sensory systems except olfactory. Remember, the olfactory nerve is the only one that goes directly to the cerebral cortex. Do not pass the thalamus. Do not collect $200. Other areas of the diencephalon are named for their locations relative to the thalamus, not similarities of function. So anything with thalamus in their name is part of the diencephalon. So the thalamus itself, they're individual groups of thalamic nuclei. There's three different ones: relay, association, and nonspecific nuclei. You don't necessarily have to know that, but each one has specialized function. Like the relay nuclei convey information from the sensory systems, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum to the cerebral cortex. So that's its executive assistant role, where it collects all that information, processes it, and then hands it over to the cerebral cortex for further action. The association nuclei process emotional and some memory information and integrate different types of sensation. So that makes sense. Association, it's putting together and integrating things. And nonspecific nuclei regulate consciousness, arousal, and attention. So lots of different nuclei. We're not going to talk about the different names of them, even though there's a lot of that in the book. But just know that the thalamus is critical processing area in our brain. The hypothalamus is essential for individual and species survival because it integrates behavioral functions with visceral functions. Electrical stimulation of hypothalamic area can cause an animal to search for and ingest food as long as the stimulation is applied. So a lot of neural research is done with animals. I don't feel too great about that, but I don't do that research still, though. So if you take an electrode and stimulate a rat's brain in the hypothalamus, it will eat and eat and eat and keep looking for food as long as you continue to stimulate the hypothalamus. Bilateral destruction of the areas associated with eating behaviors will cause an animal to refuse food. Even if the food's sitting right there, they will starve. So obviously the hypothalamus has a serious survival function. So other functions that the hypothalamus has, well, maintaining homeostasis, that's a biggie. Eating, reproductive, and defensive behaviors, also biggie. Emotional expressions of pleasure, rage, fear, and aversion. Regulation of circadian rhythms in concert with other brain regions. And endocrine regulation of growth, metabolism, and reproductive organs. So the hypothalamus, hugely important area in our brain. And it's right in the center. So all these things in the diencephalon, right in the center of the brain. The epithalamus The major structure of the epithalamus is the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is believed to help regulate circadian rhythms and to influence the secretions of the pituitary gland, adrenal and parathyroid glands, and the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. Those are the guys that do insulin. So obviously the epithalamus is really important to survival as well. The pineal gland is the target gland for melatonin, which is part of triggering our sleep cycle. And it's thought that it's sensitive to light and light cycles, so circadian rhythms. Makes sense, right? The subthalamus is in the diencephalon superior to the substantia nigra of the midbrain, but clearly, from its name, under the thalamus. It's part of the basal ganglia circuit, which is involved in regulating movement. It facilitates basal ganglia output nuclei. So it's, I'd say its major function is the coordinating with the basal ganglia in regulating movement. So subcortical white matter, all white matter consists of myelinated axons, right? That's why it's white. The subcortical white matter fibers are classified into three categories: projection, commensal, and association. So projection fibers send information from one area of the cerebral cortex to another. Commensal fibers include the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres of the brain, and association fibers help bring information together in smaller areas of the brain. So the corpus callosum is part of subcortical white matter, and sometimes they surgically sever it in order to stop seizure activity. Colostomy is performed in cases of intractable epilepsy when excessive neuronal activity cannot be controlled by medication or surgical damage of a single cortical site. So they sever the corpus callosum. A lot of times they use specialized tests to see what happens in a colostomy, mostly involving the assessment of vision and stereognosis, but it's really interesting when the hemispheres aren't connected what you see. So basal ganglia we talked about in their own little chapter. They're vital for normal motor function. They sequence movements, regulate muscle tone and muscle force, select and inhibit specific motor synergies, and they're involved with cognitive functions and some non-motor functions too, besides cognitive. So basal ganglia are involved in sustained attention, ability to change behavior as task requirements change, and motivation. So people with basal ganglia dysfunction frequently are very cognitively rigid. It's difficult for them to change their behavior when the task requirements change. And they also lack motivation and lack sustained attention. That makes it very difficult to do things.